Welcome, everyone, to our 19th Salon of the Maternal Gift Economy Breaking Through series, hosted by Genevieve, Vaughan, and the International Feminists for a Gift Economy. I'm Letitia Layson. I'm your moderator. We are so pleased to have Starhawk and Wanda Stewart with us today. They're going to be talking about the gift of permaculture. Our guests are going to be speaking together. So I'm going to do a short introduction for both of them, and I'm going to turn it over to them. There's going to be a Q&A at the end of the first hour. So let's begin. First, I'd like to introduce Starhawk. Starhawk is an author, an activist, a permaculture designer, a teacher, and a prominent voice in the modern earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism. She's the author and co-author of 13 books, including The Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, and the ecotopian novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, The City of Refuge. It's just been such a delight, and we're so pleased to have Starhawk with us. We've done a lot of work together over the years, and it's been delightful. So thank you, Starhawk, for coming. And our next guest is Wanda Stewart. She's an African-American urban farmer, educator, comrade to many in the movement to teach and inspire others to grow themselves, their food, and their community. She believes that cultivating food and medicine, maintaining a healthy being, and living cooperatively are essential skills for our collective survival. To support that learning, growth, and healing, she revisits our shared history and trauma, reframing and reclaiming cultural knowledge and heritage while tending the land. I want to invite you to visit our website so you can get Wanda's full bio and also contact information, as well as for Starhawk. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to these fabulous women so they can just get started in their conversation for us.
Thanks, Letitia. It's so great to see you and great to see all of you and be here. And thank you, Jen, for instigating all of this wonderful stuff with your work and all that you've done over the years. I want to just say I am speaking from a place currently called San Francisco, originally called Yalamu, the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone, and to honor the indigenous people of this land and encourage you to honor the original peoples of the land that you are on. Permaculture is very much about taking root in place, and I'm going to share some slides and show you some pictures, and Wanda and I are going to talk about various kinds of work that we're doing. But I just wanted to say I came into doing permaculture through many years of doing earth-based spirituality and goddess-centered stuff. And when I first learned about permaculture, to me, it seemed like the practical application of the idea that the earth is sacred. It also seemed a good antidote to just many years of activism and a lot of kind of frontline, protest and work to stop some of the destruction, which is so vital to do and so important to do. But I think in order to sustain that in our lives, it really helps to have some way to get your hands in the dirt, some way to actually grow something, to do something where you see immediate positive results. And for me, permaculture kind of pointed some of the practical ways toward solutions. I direct an organization called Earth Activist Training that teaches permaculture design with a grounding in spirit and a focus on organizing and activism. As part of that, we have a very active program offering diversity scholarships, really working to create more diversity in the whole permaculture movement. That's one of the principles in permaculture and ecology, is that diversity generates resilience. And I find that to be true, that when you have a diversity of people with diverse backgrounds and life experiences and heritages, then you have a wealth of intelligence and a spectrum of experiences that really enriches all of the work that you do. Um, One of the things we're actually working on now, I have a friend who has worked with a group of Afghan permaculturalists for the past decade or so, and they're working very, very hard now to get some of these people out of Afghanistan because their lives are now threatened because of their work on human rights and environmental justice. So I'll probably be talking a bit more about that at the end, but for now I am going to share my screen. So this is an image actually someone created for our Fifth Sacred Thing project at one point. And it's a little bit of an image of how the world might be. And I like to always start with that because I think it's important that we have a vision of what we want and not just a vision of what we don't want. Right now, of course, we're dealing with all kinds of things, from the coronavirus to all of the impacts of, industrial civilization, from oil spills to nuclear accidents, tar sands, and the incredible destructive aspect of mining for fossil fuels, fracking, and of course, climate change, which brings us what we're experiencing now here in California, of drought. Other places are experiencing flooding and storms. And of course, fire, which out here on the West Coast is, I just cannot begin to describe how much of our consciousness is taken up by the issue of fire. The smoke in the air, the bad air, the threats of wildfire. It's an omnipresent reality. And along with that go some of our other plagues, like racism, all of those interlocking isms that oppress people and that identify certain groups as the ones who have value and others as the ones who are expendable and the ones who don't, and whose lives are mined for the benefit of the few. Which always brings me to one of my favorite quotes from Bill Mollison, who is one of the foundational thinkers in permaculture, that evil is stupidity rigorously applied. I think if you look at the news at all these days, that becomes absolutely evident. So, what is the relationship of the brutality of the police power to the brutality of the fossil fuels and the power systems that are destroying the earth? I say it's, power, centralized power needs centralized power. And it's easy for it to put the boot on all of our necks. But we can also look at it as a shift in consciousness. So we live in a world where what is sacred, what is of value, has kind of been pictured like this, something that's high and light and white and out of this world somewhere, and just up there in the sky, shedding its radiance. But really, maybe what we should think of as sacred is this. Maybe it's not so pretty, but it actually is creating real fertility for the earth. And any of you who are gardeners know how precious those worm castings are. we should think of it as this. This is a mycelial web that underlies, it's the actual living body of a mushroom. It's a kind of underground web of single-celled threads that hold the soil, that help plants obtain more nutrients from the soil, that has the capacity to break down toxins. Or this, the chlorophyll molecule. What greater alchemy is there in the world than this amazing molecule that uses sunlight to break apart air and water and transform into food that underlies all the major food chains and food webs of life. So maybe when we think of what's sacred, we should think about the earth. When we think about earth, we often say dirt. Things that somehow are close to the earth are dirty. We talk about things being soiled. We devalue it, but if we saw it as sacred, we might look at the world differently. We might see that, what is sacred, it might actually be what is dark and down and dirty and close to the ground and real and not so high and light and disembodied. And that might give us a different image of what is sacred in humans. We might be not so quick to disparage darker people. It might make us look differently at women, because women and women's lives and bodies and all of our sort of messy, bloody bodily processes always are more identified with the earth and with the wonderful gifts of the plant world, like comfrey, the healing herb. That's also such a beautiful pattern of fractals. George Lakoff is a wonderful thinker about politics and language. And he talks about this idea of framing, that we look through the world through these overarching kind of metaphors, and that unless we make conscious choices about what frames we use, unless we frame ourselves, we're going to be defined by others and framed by others. So, for example, he talks about our frame here in the US. We have this sort of overarching frame that the country is kind of like a family. And we've got one set of people who think that a family should be run by a strict father, that life is tough and people need to be and told to shape up and, made to pull their own weight. And we have another frame that says the country is like a family, and a family should be a place of nurturing, should be nurturing parents, feeding, helping. What a family is supposed to do is help you develop your fullest potential, see you for who you are. And that you can look at our politics and see these two frames playing out against each other. Our world has this overarching frame of scarcity, that resources are scarce, that there isn't enough to go around. And it's a dog-eat-dog world. You've really got to fight to survive. And the fittest, the strongest win and somehow deserve to win. And in that world, we fund the cops. We fund force in all its ways, war, military, the prison. Instead of really looking at the world as a place of regenerative abundance. And I think, to me, that's one of the great gifts of permaculture, is to make this shift in thinking. Say, yes, we can look at the world as a place. Nature is abundant, is generous, provides more than what we need. That's out on my land. In that framework, we owe each other mutual aid and support. And we might fund teachers and helpers and caregivers, social workers. Those are actually my parents. They're both social workers, so I come by it honestly, right? Gardeners, and, I love this quote too, like, what would the world be like if we replace this idea of scarcity with the goal of creating as much real abundance as possible? I think that's part of the gift, you could say, of the idea of the gift economy. When you are giving, one of the things you receive in return when you make a gift is the sense that you are coming from abundance. You are someone who has something to give. And the more that we give, the more that we receive, the more abundance we generate. So how do we design systems? It's permaculture, in its essence, is a system of design, of regenerative and justly shared abundance. That's our question. Permaculture has three core ethics: care for the earth, care for the people, and the third gets framed a lot of different ways. I like care for the future, but it's also about sharing the surplus, being generous, giving, reducing consumption, putting back into the system the fruits of that system. And all of these are based on the idea of interconnectedness. We are all part of the same web. So permaculture also takes nature as our model for what we design. It's the idea if we observe, we watch. We value diversity. Like I said, diversity creates resilience. That's both in the garden and also in our human systems. That might mean planting polycultures instead of giant rows of just monoculture, clonal things that are genetically identical. It means understanding that as change makers, that change has many different niches to fill. And we don't all have to work for it in the same way, or we don't, even in our own lives, have to work for it in the same way all of the time. So that's, advocacy. There's the path of resistance, which is really vitally important. There's finding resources and funding and working. This was a project we were doing in the inner city in San Francisco in Baby Hunters Point, creating a garden for a local agency, working with at-risk youth, getting research and data. Sometimes lawsuits, legal challenges, elections are really vitally important too. So when we think about political activism, I like to think about it, strategy, as a design process, just like in permaculture. This is kind of like a model we might use for designing a garden or a ranch or a farm or a political campaign. You start with topo, which is thoughtful and protracted observation. You're clear about having an ethical intention. And then within that, you're going to be doing visioning and planning and feedback loops between the two of them. So we need to have that vision. We need to assess and analyze what we're doing. There are different models for looking at, again, whether you're designing a ranch or a political campaign. What's our resources? What's the constraints? What are opportunities and risks? Who are our allies? Who are our opponents? What are the pillars of power that support the oppressive system? Whether that is in, again, in our politics, or whether it is in, designing out some kind of flaw in our garden. And how do we knock them down? And what's the palette of solutions? And I think when we look at climate change, it's really important to know what the solutions are, because it's really easy for people to just go into despair. So for climate change, for example, we need to preserve what we've got. If we've got old growth, we've got any kind of pristine environment. I think we need to honor indigenous wisdom. We're learning that here in California about how the indigenous people used fire for thousands of years to manage the land, to burn in seasons when you could burn safely and reduce the fuel load so you didn't get catastrophic wildfires. It's a low prescribed burn. This is dog bane, and we have a wonderful friend and ally named Redbird Willie who's been tending a patch of dog bane in the Santa Rosa area for many, many years, and has spoken about how there have been a number of wildfires that have ripped through that area, including one a couple of years ago that really came into the town and burned whole neighborhoods and caused great loss of life. It moved so quickly. And he was saying, yeah, that was our dog bane patch. People knew that that's where the fires came because of the shapes of the hills and the direction of the prevailing winds in the fall when it's hot and dry and the wind's blowing from inland. And dogbane needs fire to really flourish and to grow and to be useful for basketry and the things that they made with the baskets. So we can learn these things and understand the patterns of the landscape. We can make our lives more safe. Alternative energy, it's not a new idea. These are windmills in Holland that are still grinding pigments and are the same mills that ground the pigments for Rembrandt. And newer versions. This is the parking lot of the railway station in Amsterdam. And finally, one of the things we talk a lot about in permaculture is the ways that we can sequester carbon in soil. And to me, that's one of the hopeful things, right, is understanding that climate change isn't just about carbon numbers. It's really about how we treated the earth and how we treated the land and how we have created dysfunctional ecosystems all over the world that are degrading and that are contributing to that excess carbon and to so many other of the problems. But the good part is our soils are actually hungry. Soil organic carbon, that's humus, that's soil fertility. That has so many benefits, even beyond taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so, again, this is the hopeful gift to me of the permaculture movement and the regenerative agriculture movement is really understanding we can take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into that soil organic matter. And how do we do that? We use this amazing technology, this incredible machine that nature created hundreds of millions of years ago. It's called plants, right? It's called cycle of photosynthesis and decay. So many ways, from compost, sheet mulch, worms, compost teas, hugelkultur. It's like building up big hills over, stacked up old pieces of wood. Biochar. We can, in the Q&A, if people are interested, we can talk more about any of these no-till systems where you're not digging the ground up and turning it over, and planting trees and perennial systems. Some of these are all different ways that we can be agents of earth healing and countering climate change. I want to take a little break right now that we're talking about planting trees and perennial systems, and you're seeing one of our community gardens where our kids were working with an organization called Common Ground that plants fruit trees. And to me, it's a perfect moment to turn it over to Wanda and hear some of the work that she's been doing, because that's exactly what she's been doing.
Thank you, Star. Um, I have to say to everyone here that my introduction to to permaculture was Starhawk. Back in 2014, though I'd been associated with her in whole other avenues, um, I took her 2 week long permaculture course as a novice gardener, and as one who was sort of developing her own homestead. And in Berkeley, for as much as one can have a homestead in Berkeley. And the greatest gift to me in all of that, beyond the friendship and the love, was having a frame for the metaphors between plants and people. So one of the things I very shortly did after beginning to study permaculture and grow my own space was to stop being a school administrator as I had been, and I became a school gardener. And I grew a garden in West Oakland in the fabulous company of about 350 children in grades kindergarten through 5. Um, and I will tell you that we grew quite the food farce. That garden is now about 6 years old. It is home to probably approaching 50 fruit trees. There's a grandmother elderberry that is amazing. Um, and I consider, in terms of permaculture principles, the work that I do in school gardens for me is the best example of stacking functions, right? Um, First, because I need to grow myself first. And then it helps me at the same time that I'm growing me and taking care of my body to build community in and through gardens and to be doing good work in the world, right? In terms of the environment, in terms of carbon sequestration and all of those kinds of things. Um, I appreciate doing it in schools and with children because I'm like, after I take care of my own body, I can teach them how to feed their body, right? I can teach them how to connect with one another across culture, right? Um, we can teach them how to become good earth stewards, even though they are babies. Um, and I just know that that is essential work. So in the pandemic, uh, rather than I made a conscious decision not to be scared and not to feed into the fearfulness of it all, and instead focus my work and my attention on building the world that we're transitioning to. And I know that the children are an essential and vital part of that. Um, I want to show you a picture really quickly. I'm going to share my screen. So this picture is a picture of the Hoover Elementary School garden in West Oakland. And those are some of my babies. The kids that go to Hoover Elementary are overwhelmingly Black and brown and beige. Now that we have a mature garden after 6 years, honestly, there are a couple more white kids, but not very many. But it's a bunch of kids for whom life can be hard and very real. We had a fifth grader who graduated on a Friday, and the very next morning, his father was shot and gunned down at 2:30 in the afternoon in front of he and his friends, right? And so these kids again need frames, like Star mentioned, to understand how to deal with the complexity of their lives, as we all do. So we talk a lot about the circle of life, right? And not just the circle of life of plants, not just the circle of life of ladybugs and butterflies, of which we have very many, but their life cycle and how we are all seeds and how we are all gonna pass. But that what's important is what we leave behind them. This picture, though, was taken on March 13th, 2020. And that's the day that Oakland Unified School District shut down schools because of the pandemic. And my response, again, focusing on what we could do and manage, was to run to school and send all the kids home. We went out to the garden. We harvested all those collard greens you see. Those are perennial collard greens. They're called purple collards. And most of the kids went home with big bags of vegetables and also herbs, plantain, mullein, oregano, mint. And why that just happened to be what was prolific and abundant in the garden on that particular day, they also happen to be the herbs that one needs for respiratory health, right? So after the kids left, and you see, they don't, I look at the picture and I wonder if they were scared. I remember taking the picture and I was terrified, right? Because we didn't know what was coming. But they went out victorious with their greens and their medicine. And after they left, I cried. And one, because it was all so worrisome. But I had also never felt quite so empowered by the work that I had done, right? Because I realized that not even just the work I'd done, but also the work that these children had done. As a result, in a disaster, we had food for our families. We had medicine for our families. Those children know that you can snip off the top of those perennial collard greens and strip off the big leaves and stick it back down in the soil and grow new plants. They knew what to do with that medicine, that it didn't matter whether they drank it as a tea. They didn't, they knew to tell their parents to smoke mullein with anything else they smoked, right? And not only was it for me empowering in terms of the moment, I was never been so proud to know that I was putting young people and babies out in the world who understood these principles and knew how to do it. So I think, Star, I'll stop there. And we can sort of go back and forth if you like. But I will tell you that so I didn't see most of those kids for almost 2 years. And I've been seeing them in the last few weeks. And they are amazed at how this garden has grown, right? Because the other gifts of permaculture and the garden, it teaches patience. It teaches perseverance, right? And it teaches faith, because you got to have a whole lot of faith that you can take a eeny weeny mullein seed and put it in the deep, dark soil that Star talked about and believe that you're actually going to get something that will sustain you, right? And these children living in their hardscape ghetto know that, right? And we created an ecosystem where there's like literally a bluebird of happiness, which was maybe one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. Monarch butterflies, even a little pond that we built and lined with plastic generated frogs, right? And to be able to put real nature and life-size nature down on the schoolyard so that these young people understand why they have to be earth stewards, right? If nature is not around you, if you don't interact with it, you don't develop the nature proficiency you need to survive, right? And these kids have it. So we're thriving despite it all. What do you think, Star?
I think it is wonderful, Wanda. I'm going to go back. Can you all see that now? Yeah. So just again, some of those other gifts that we talk about. It's the idea, as Wanda was talking about, those wonderful collards that are perennials, that you plant them once and you don't have to keep digging it up every year. The more that we can build systems around perennials, we talk about building food forests that look like a forest, but where everything in it actually either meets a human need or supports the forest itself. This is, again, on my land where I have a kind of Mediterranean food forest with olives and rosemary and other herbs. You know, the community gardens, like the school garden Wanda's been working in, like the community gardens we were working in San Francisco, that again give kids who never otherwise really get to interact with nature a chance to experience and to learn from that. And they can also be places of community, like feeding, celebrating. That's hard to do with COVID, but at least with COVID, we can still gather outdoors. So sometimes gardens have become actually much more crucial during COVID as a place to meet and a place to connect.
Star,
Yeah.
I would say to that, in those COVID times, even though everything was shut down, I never quarantined.
Mm-hmm.
Because agricultural workers are the first thing on the list of essential workers. And there was a group of us that kept working in this garden throughout the quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
No one stopped us. It was okay. No one got sick. And we built community in doing that, that both sustained us and reassured all of us as we were working through what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then also built sort of perennialized relationships with one another, right? And most particularly across culture. So that in our school, for instance, there are a couple of Iraqi women who are Muslim by faith and culture. And they weren't real sure what to do with the Black woman trying to talk to them about growing land.
Uh-huh.
But when I was able to give them figs and fava beans that were organic, we began to have a different kind of conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the Black kids and the Latino kids were starting to have just a lot of beef with each other because the numbers were pretty equal.
Mm-hmm.
We made a pot of collard greens and chayote in one pot, which is delicious, right?
Uh-huh.
The sweet of the chayote and the bitter of the collard greens just makes for a wonderful stew. And in those, for those kids, I could walk up to them and go, "You all need to get along like collard greens and chayote," as a fight was getting ready to brew, right?
Uh-huh.
And it stopped the fight, like literally.
Mm.
So that work of community is essential. And I tell the kids, I can teach you to grow a plant, and so I'll teach you to grow yourself. And when we grow this garden, we're going to grow a community.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Again, that stacking function.
So yeah, it is that getting your hands in the dirt. I think it's John Jevons talks about where you're not really growing plants, you're growing soil. And you're not really just growing soil, you're growing people that know how to grow soil. Water is also a key issue around climate change. So a lot of what we're trying to do is rehydrate the earth, capture that water, slow it down, spread it out, sink it in, using techniques like swales, which are a level ditch that's on contour, the berm, so when fills up when it rains and the water infiltrates and sinks in. There's a lot of work around grazing and different ways of managing livestock. Alan Savory is one of the great thinkers who really understood that desertification of dry lands was happening, not because there were too many animals on the land, but because the animals weren't being managed in ways that actually mimicked natural grasslands. Natural grasslands co-evolved with grazers, and that they actually need grazing to have their health restored. And it's important, this is important. I'm sure probably most of you are not like going to be raising cattle or sheep, but I think it's important to understand this in terms of policy, in terms of the choices we make about what we eat. You know, a lot of people assume that for climate change, you need to be a vegan. But in terms of the environment, it's not so much whether or not you eat meat, it's about which meat. You know, if that meat is produced in factory farms, it's horrible for the environment and for your health. If that meat is actually produced in regenerative systems that can restore grasslands, it's actually beneficial for the environment. And if it's something like a Beyond Burger that's like grown in a vat of, you know, genetically engineered soy, chemically altered, and sold to you as plant-based and good for the environment, it is actually detrimental to the environment and probably will turn out to be detrimental to your health. So if we can restore grasslands, you know, something like about 40% of the Earth's surface is grasslands. And using Savory's methods, you can restore those grasslands, bring them back to health by mimicking the way that natural herds moved around grasslands in big bunches with predators, keeping them together, and they'd eat, you know, poop and move on quickly. And then they wouldn't come back till the grass had recovered. And we mimic that process. It regenerates the land stores carbon, it helps to repair the water cycle, so it holds on to more water. The same with growing a garden. You know, that garden that Wanda is growing is going to hold on to water, take in the water when it rains. You know, if you compare it to a strip of asphalt or an empty lot that's all compacted where the water pools and runs off and goes into sewers, you know, a living garden with healthy soil is going to absorb all that water, hold on to it, need less water to grow, and that helps to repair the whole system. So with the grazing systems, you move your stock around in dense groups and then move them often and then don't bring them back till the land has recovered. Thinking about localizing, growing our food close to where we eat it. Again, like Wanda's talking about, it makes a huge difference if you can pick fruit from your school garden or your backyard than if you're eating something. The average piece of food travels something like 1,500 miles before it gets to your plate. You know. So in Cuba, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost their source of oil, their economy crashed. They say the average Cuban lost a third of their body weight in that following year. But what they did was they shifted to growing food in and around their cities, like in this agroponico. And it made a huge difference. You know, for quite a while there, they were growing something like 70% of their food in and around their cities. And of course, in the tropics, you can grow this incredible abundance of food. These were some of the little sistemas, these little backyard gardens we got to visit when I was there for a permaculture convergence. And I loved the bicycle transport. You know, they shifted to ways of moving things around that didn't require fossil fuels. There's a whole movement called transition towns. That's about getting people to organize in communities to use the resources that we still got to prepare for this lower energy future. This is in a place called Crouch End, a neighborhood of London. They have this grocery store that sells what they call food from the sky that's grown in this community garden right on top of the grocery store. And I love that. It doesn't get much more local than that. It's my friend Rebecca. Love her bright red hair and the green plants. Yeah. So what we're talking about with permaculture is thinking about, we're not just designing separate things, we're designing relationships. Like Wanda was talking about in the garden, in some sense, it's not even the collard greens. it's the relationship that the kids have to those collard greens, making the connections, thinking about the flows. And that's all about building community. One of my favorite groups is called City Repair in Portland, Oregon. And what they've done is taken streets and turned them into gathering places, painting the streets, creating gatherings. This one, they've got a little tea station where somebody always keeps hot water there, so you can have a cup of tea anytime you want. They have a village building convergence, or they did before COVID, where people can come together and do projects together. They've got this little tea wagon that goes around the city and can open up its wings and create an instant gathering space. This is another one of their projects. It's based on the sunflower pattern. This is, again, teaching kids to plant seeds. And, there's the seeds of a different world that really require standing up to the challenges that we have right now. But there's also this principle I call feed what you want to grow, that often, our everything from our foreign policy to our agriculture is based on the idea that if there's something you don't want, nuke it, kill it, get rid of it, whether that's a weed or whether that's a terrorist. But what we know from gardening is that the more you try to do that, the more the weeds develop resistance. And that's true with people as well. So what we try to do in permaculture is more say, well, what do we want to grow, and how do we create the conditions that are going to favor that, rather than try to destroy what we don't want. Another one of our principles is the idea of edge, that where two different systems meet, you get this third system that has more dynamism, more energy, more diversity, often more creativity, sometimes more conflict. But whether that's where the ocean meets the shore or whether the clowns meet the cops, right? Interesting things can happen. And I think in some ways our activism is around creating those edges, understanding those edges, bringing those edges into places where they can create important energies for change. So how do we, I think right now our question is, how do we break through the denial, the waves of disinformation that surround us? How do we take apart destructive systems and defend the systems that we love? Protect what's sacred. Some of these are from a mobilization we organized when a genetic engineering conference was held in San Francisco. We created a garden in the street of organic plants, and people locked down around it. What do we do right now when things seem so dire to kindle hope and wonder? I think we have to remember that creativity is an unlimited resource, and that's what we can tap into with the kids in the garden, with the creativity of nature, with our own creativity. So welcome to Possible.
I have been amazed at what has grown in feeding what we want to grow. It wasn't necessarily easy to grow a garden with the children and have the teachers and the adults embrace it as a good thing to do, particularly within the context of school. Right? But for instance, in the case of an individual, there's a kid named Jamari that is just very close to my heart. but he was hard to have into your classroom, right? Because he's bouncing all around. He'll throw a tantrum. He will fight. He will do that. And what I discovered, and he was a kid that got into a lot of trouble, sent to the office all the time. But what I discovered is that Jamari was really happy in the garden, really grounded by having his hands in soil, right? And helping the adults around him understand to feed that part of him instead of perpetually weeding him out was a big success. And I'd say the same thing at the garden level. Oakland Unified School District is not known for its ability to even cooperate with itself to provide education, much less cooperate with garden educators. But one of the gifts of this pandemic has been everybody wants to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. Everybody knows that we got to figure out this community piece. And most importantly to schools, everybody's trying to learn outdoors, right? So now those edges you talk about, and there's a very literal edge between our massive blacktop asphalt playground and this lush oasis of a garden. And now those systems really are coming together to merge and work together in ways that are going to improve what the district offers its students generally.
Yeah, that is so inspiring and so wonderful. I think for a lot of kids, like what we call ADHD and a lot of those behavioral problems are partly nature deprivation. They're partly just, it's so unnatural to keep kids sitting inside at a desk. That it's no wonder that a lot of them don't tolerate it. And it's so great when they can have that sensual, when you're in a garden, it's like all your senses are alive, your hands are in the earth, you're smelling, you're tasting, you're surrounded by a richness of the environment that you just don't get inside.
Right. Well, and the teachers too. I will tell you, one of those teachers, she came to the edge where the blacktop meets the garden, and she said, I can't come any further. This was probably about 3 years ago. I said, what do you mean you can't come further? It was like another 200 feet across the mulch path to get into the center of the garden. And she said, I can't step on this grass. I'll get my shoes dirty. And then I did not lose it. Although internally I was flabbergasted. And she explained that, she had white sneakers on and she can't do soil and all this kind of stuff. She's the very teacher now that has been in the garden handing out her homework to the sort of learning packages to kids when they were doing online learning. And she's one of the first teachers to be out there teaching her general coursework out in the garden instead of in the classroom.
You're reminding me of one time when we were taking a bunch of our kids out to one of the urban gardens. There was a great garden in San Francisco called at Hayes Valley that was built on a freeway off-ramp that had fallen down in the earthquake. And we went out and it was a rainy, muddy day. And one of these kids, he looked at me, he's like, I can't go there. I looked down, he had this brand new, just like sparkling white pair of sneakers on that were clearly like some, important brand, very expensive, the pride of his heart. So I just looked at him and I whipped out a couple of pair of plastic bags.
Yes.
And just covered the sneakers.
Yeah.
It worked.
Right. But even those are great conversations to be able to have, right?
Yeah.
I also had the same trouble with kids who had sneakers. One of the kids actually revealed to me that he'd been disciplined harshly, we'll say, because he came home with dirt on his black sneakers. And it's interesting, his father happened to be an old student of mine growing up. And I was able to talk to the kids about, if you know that you're in a situation like that, then you need to remember what day you have gardening,
Mm.
right? And not wear those shoes. Or if you must wear those shoes, bring an old pair of shoes to keep in your classroom, right?
Mhm.
So that we were able to teach them how to manage their own lives so they could pursue passions
Mhm.
and be free in an outside situation and not have to worry, um, about parents. And to that parent that I had relationship with, I
Mhm.
was able to suggest that Justin look at sneakers and material possessions as a different way, and also be able to casually tell him, please don't send your kid here to school, because and he tells me that you've beaten him over this, because
Okay.
that's like a reportable offense, right? So being able to even talk about parenting with him, all of those things, we all come along and grow just like those
Mhm.
gardens. Nobody talks about shoes and sneakers and getting dirty anymore at Hoover Elementary.
And that's also, I think, one of the gifts of permaculture and gardening. We always talk about permaculture as a system of design. And what design means is thinking, planning ahead, like thinking about what you have and assessing it, thinking about what you want, and making a plan to get from here to there.
Yes,
And that's one of those really valuable life skills,
yes,
and if kids learn it by thinking about, oh, I can bring a pair of old sneakers and keep them in the classroom, that's actually in some ways a much more important learning than even, how much sunlight a collard green needs.
right. That's right.
And I love the garden because it offers so many of those opportunities.
Oh, lessons in character, right?
Yeah.
We have to do a lot of cardboard mulching in our garden because of the Bermuda grass.
Hmm.
When you have 30 kids and 39 cubic yards of
Hmm.
mulch on the playground, and they get challenged at the beginning of the year to move that in. Like if you move this entire pile of mulch, and 39 cubic yards of mulch is a whole lot of mulch,
Wow. Yeah.
right? We'll have a party at the end of the year, right?
Hmm.
But we can really quickly cardboard mulch this little space right here and have some immediate success, right?
Yeah.
They had success in their ability to quickly impact their environment, but also the experience of extended effort across time, and also uh, teamwork, right? And finding out what jobs you excel at and what you like to do and what others do and how we can work together. So when the test scores at our school, we were the bottom school in the entire district. Our school had lower test scores than the alternative high school. If you can really compare those two, which you probably shouldn't, but
Mhm.
they do. And the principal mentioned this, and I said, "Oh my God, the impact of the garden." And we've had to win this and bring this principal along. And she said, what would test scores have to do with the garden?
Mm.
Right. And, I simply said, we taught them teamwork. We taught
Mhm.
them cooperation. So now when Jamari is in the classroom and the rest of the class can actually do their standardized test scores and fill in those little bubbles that you all like,
Mhm.
because he understands, even if he doesn't do it for himself,
Mhm.
he understands that cooperation with your peers impacts their learning,
Mm.
right? And those are the kinds of things that I love giving people to take out into the world to apply in that permaculture people kind of way.
Mhm.
I think that's a beautiful place for us to sort of open it up to see if there are any questions from our audience, for those of you who are with us today, or any comments that you would like to make. I do want to take note that there are quite a few of our other presenters who are here in our audience, like Marta Benavides, who has a permaculture garden in El Salvador, San Salvador. I see that Darcia is here, who works directly and about children and the empty nest.
Mhm.
So she's here. We have Mary Claire from the Sekhmet Temple. So if any of you have any comments or questions, otherwise we're just going to let Starhawk and Wanda continue. But I wonder, Genevieve, do you have anything that you'd like to add or questions for our two panelists? Comments?
I'd like to ask Starhawk to talk more about the Earth activist training that she does or
Mhm.
that they do.
Yeah, I'm going to say hi to Marta. Marta was actually in the first permaculture training I took with our teacher, Penny Livingston Stark, and has been doing amazing work in El Salvador. I've gotten to visit there a couple times many years ago, and we actually met through Jen, through a conference that Jen organized more decades ago than I think either one of us should ever admit to. Right? Because I remember sitting there and talking, and Marta and I were both 34 years old at that point. So it was a while back, right? Um, yeah, Earth Activist Training, Penny and I started it. We had both been at the big blockade in Seattle in 1999 against the World Trade Organization. And we kind of came away saying, like, wow, there's this whole generation of young activists, and they're really on fire with this idea of changing the world. But a lot of them don't know what to change it into. And we know all of these permaculture people, that have these great solutions, but often seem a little naive about the power structures that are in the way of getting them implemented. So how can we bring these together? And we decided to do permaculture trainings that really had a focus on organizing and activism and using permaculture, sort of using that lens of ecology and understanding of nature's patterns to also look at the human patterns of how we organize and how we make change. Um, and we started that in 1999, I think, or in 2000, and we've been doing it ever since. We teach permaculture design certificate courses, which are 72-hour courses that are kind of standardized around the world in terms of some of the topics, but they're kind of your entry into the permaculture world. And we teach them online right now with COVID. We've got one going on right now, but also hopefully we're going to be doing one in person in January. We've been sort of in the forefront of developing something people are calling social permaculture, which is the idea of how do we consciously design our human relations, or at least our organizations and our structures, to further beneficial human relations, and use again some of these insights about how the patterns of nature work. And we're going to be doing one of those online starting in October, that everyone is welcome to join and be part of. We also have developed longer term programs in regenerative land management, that in conjunction with the Permaculture Institute of North America, that offer a permaculture diploma, and have other courses connected to that. We've got a course in regenerative business design taught by a wonderful woman named Patty Love, and we're developing a course in permaculture infrastructure and disaster planning, and lots of internship opportunities for people, because we really feel like shifting the way that we relate to land is part of the answer to climate change. But in order to shift that relationship with land, we need the people who are capable of doing it, and we need to shift our relationships to other people to make those regenerative as well. We need to address those larger systems and counter some of those social plagues I was talking about, those isms we started with at the beginning. And yeah, we have a website, earthactivisttraining.org. We also have an online community we've set up called online.earthactivisttraining.org that can function as a sort of alternative social network to something like Facebook. Not on the same scale, but it works for us. We've been able to offer that platform to other groups that are doing things. Like we had a wonderful group of some of the young folks that Wanda has worked with and I've worked with who are doing a beautiful program in decolonizing the dreamer, really like looking at some of the ways we can address racism and address these overarching systems, but doing it with so much creativity and imagination. It was beautiful. And so, yeah, we do a lot of fundraising so that we can offer diversity scholarships for people of color and Indigenous people. We try to do a lot of mentoring with teachers and trainers. We have a wonderful young woman who we have mentored who's now directing our regenerative land management program, who's from the Standing Rock Reserve and has been doing awesome projects on that reserve. And as I said, I think this coming week we're going to be launching some fundraising to help support these Afghan permaculture teachers and students if we can get them out of Afghanistan. So if it's okay with you, I think we're going to get your contact information after this and I will send you out something about that and promise not to bombard you over and over again with too much stuff, but it'll include links where you can get on mailing lists and stuff if you want to be bombarded over and over again with stuff.
Thanks, Starhawk. I think we now have some questions that are coming in. Liliana, would you like to start us off with some questions?
Yeah, we have a question from Peggy Antrobus. And the question is, are Starhawk's projects connected to the groups in Barbados or anywhere in the Caribbean?
I don't directly have a project in the Caribbean, but I do have a couple of students who have projects in the Caribbean that if you're interested, you could email me and I could put you in touch with them.
Perfect. That was Peggy Antrobus, who also was one of our past presenters and is quite interested in permaculture and donut economies. And Angela Dolmich is here, who also has a permaculture community, which is a matriarchal community called Nashira. And it's owned by women and they own the housing, but they've set up a permaculture garden so that it's sustainable. So welcome to you too, and thank you for joining us. Judith, I wonder if you have a question for us.
Kat asks, how can I learn to draw a design in a public space to create a community meeting space?
Ooh. I got something on that one. So we asked the children, because we know that if the people that you're seeking to serve and engage have a say in what you design, they'll be more committed to that. So very early on, we invited the children into the design work, and in really simple ways, giving them a piece of paper, giving them magazines to cut pictures out with just the simple direction of design your garden. What do you want to have in your garden? And for this group of kids, like the overwhelming thing was food, right? And that was about hitting directly to their food insecurity, which was palpable at the time. They also wanted animals, so we got chickens. They wanted a pond, and so the dig pit that hit clay became a pond. And they also, like good city kids, they wanted bling. And I'm like, bling, you know? And they had all these diamond and crutches. What they were like, yes, we want bling in the garden. And we went and we found all kinds of sparkly things and glass colored things and things that were iridescent and glowed in the sunshine, right? And they were thrilled just even for their input to be taken. But I was also really sad about the adults that weren't coming, right? And a very wise friend of mine named Judith Israel, she said, you know, Wanda, just grow that garden and leave it to the garden to win the people. And that has completely happened in a way that just sustains me and my heart and my ability and commitment to what I do. So now when we throw work parties, we get 100 people who come out. We make sure to feed them well. We make sure it's so essential to have a DJ, right? Because people who are dancing to Sly and the Family Stone and a little bit of funk music will work really hard and long for you, right? And then we created also spaces that helped anchor the space. So we have a cob wall that's beautiful with these arches, and it really is just a wall. But I understood how important it was when one of our parents from Guatemala, she said, I'd like to see your chickens. I take her up there and I'm unlocking the gate. And I turned around and she was stroking the cob wall and crying, right? And I was like, are you okay? Or, you know, what's up? And she said, this is how we build houses in my village, right? And it struck her that deeply. So I would say, and now in that garden, I've seen guitar lessons happen. We've had African drumming. There was a puppet show with a wonderful woman named Emily Butterfly, who talked to the kids about environment. So creating these spaces, allowing the garden and the community to grow, and then using them in a myriad of ways. You know, not everybody's got to have their hands in soil. You can just be in the garden and enjoying the sanctuary that offers.
I think that's really wise advice because I've often found that people have this idea of wanting to invite the community in to the design process, but the truth is, like, the whole concept of design process and that is just like, it's just not kind of in the community's like life experience. And I think creating an event that people can come to, whether it's a music party or a community meal or something, and then sort of saying like, hey, you're here, what else would you like to see in the garden? It's going to be more successful than saying, here's our community design session, come.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've found this, I'm thinking about a project we did in Glasgow, where a group created a community garden in the path of a motorway that was going through this very working class neighborhood. And again, it was really hard to get people to come out for the design session. But once there were things there, people came out and enjoyed them. And a lot of the things that were there are things that just they never would have thought of because they'd never seen them or experienced them. I've also found even bringing pictures. When we went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, I took some of the pictures of some of those city repair projects and some of the other systems that we had and just laminated them and brought them because I knew I wasn't going to be able to show a PowerPoint. We weren't sure we'd have power at all. I knew that there were people we were going to be talking to that might not actually be able to read, weren't going to read a report. But having the pictures, people could look at them and go like, I want that. Why can't we have that in our neighborhood?
That's fabulous. Let's see if there's another question. Liliana.
Yes, from Mary B, I have a question for Wanda. Wanda, tell us more about Obsidian Farm. How did it get started? How is it run?
Wow, Obsidian Farm is my house. I named it Obsidian Farm because the rock obsidian is black, and it's about transformation. It's about going into that darkness again and transforming into a very light and wonderful place. I was really proud after I took I had been gardening at my home garden. Most of it is in the front of my house because that's where the sun shines. And my permaculture class, after we left Starhawk's land, we decided to have a goodbye party at my home. And they came down and they said, why were you in a permaculture class? You can demonstrate every permaculture principle there is right here. And honestly, I had no idea, right? And was really proud to look around and go, oh, wow. And one, this is not rocket science, right? And two, if we open up to what we know and feel about the land, we will be doing permaculture. So I've been cultivating this space probably for about the last 12 to 15 years. Really proud to say my $10 cherry tree from Grocery Outlet, which for those of you who may not know Grocery Outlet, it's the cut rate supermarket where you can find good stuff. That tree yielded 50 pounds of wonderful organic Bing cherries, right? And all of the fruit trees, I have 50 linear feet of blackberries and 3 hop stands and perennial peppers. So there's just a lot of food that I grow here, share with neighbors, often because it's in the front of the house. There are chickens. There are 2 dogs and now the requisite cat, because chickens, rats, the city, all that kind of good stuff. But it is what I've cultivated for myself and my family and use it to share in community.
And it is a wonderful example of what you can do in a small urban space.
Yes. And oh my God, my Starhawk grape. So Starhawk came to my home and she showed up with this cutting. I don't even think it was in soil. And she said, here, would you like this grape? I bought this for you. And I took this cutting off of her grape and literally stuck it in a square spot of soil by a rainwater downspout. And it started to grow across my garage and didn't have enough space to grow. So now it's most recently been trellised and it creates a whole ceiling outside so that we have this wonderful patio and people and the most delicious grapes ever. And people are like, what kind of grapes are these? I was like, those are Starhawk grapes. And that's about the best I can tell them. But I will tell anybody that when Star shows up at your house and offers you plants, intentionally take them, but know that they're going to thrive and just take over your world in the best ways.
That's a beautiful story. Starhawk grapes. Well, that is
Starhawk grapes.
awesome. Yeah,
Right?
that's
My neighbors are very impressed.
I never knew, Starhawk, that you had maybe it's going to be some wine someday. That's really fabulous.
In just a couple of weeks, actually.
Oh, I love that. Judith, I wonder if you have another question for our speakers.
There was a news story, a local news story last week about a woman who had created a guerrilla garden next to a freeway, next to the freeway off-ramp. And at the height of the summer, when everything was, and there was a whole community that was involved in that. At the height of the summer, just as the everything was ready to harvest, the landowner, which was a level of government, came in and plowed it all under.
Mm.
And they said, well, there had been a dump there once, and so the soil might have been contaminated, and they were afraid that the food might be unhealthy, so they wanted to get rid of it before anybody could eat it. And I just wondered if what kind of comment you have on that.
I think that's very sad and infuriating because, first of all, if they were worried about the soil being unhealthy, they could have tested it.
Right.
Secondly, if they're growing organically and using a lot of compost and stuff, often that stuff will actually take care of most of the contaminants. Thirdly, a lot of the contaminants that might be in the soil don't actually get taken up into the food. The real danger is more with stuff like lead, that you're going to inhale it, while you're working in the garden. So if that was true, that damage would already have been done. And fourthly, the food that most of us are buying in the grocery store is grown in soil that is so laced with herbicides and chemicals and pesticides that probably whatever was in that soil was better than 90% of what you're going to get from the grocery store. So yeah, that's my comment.
Thanks. Thanks,
I
Starhawk.
I weigh in on that a little bit too. Amen to everything that Star has just said. But we're also dealing with that in regards to the social permaculture piece of that here in the Bay. There is a houseless encampment that is home to about 400 people. They created a place called Cob on Wood where movable cob buildings have been placed so that there's a kitchen and a clinic and a free store and a music stage and a nice, again, where gardens and these natural spaces can help create places for humans. But what we're grappling, and they're illegally on that land, it's owned by the Transportation Agency in California. And we want to support those folks and we want to help grow what they are doing. But we're also having to struggle and tangle with not just that they're illegally on this land and can be evicted at any moment, but this land exists under a maze of freeways. The part of the freeway in Oakland that collapsed in the big earthquake in 1989, right? These folks live under that, and we want to help them. And help them help themselves, by the way, in that mutual way that Starhawk mentioned in her presentation. But we're also having to talk about not normalizing people living under a freeway. I go in terms of the danger. So when I go there for meetings, I hold meetings there for not longer than a half hour, because after that, I have a headache. I can taste metal in my mouth, and I know it's not, and you're also looking up at these giant trucks going over you, right? Knowing that the wrong accident, heaven forbid another earthquake, all kinds of things could happen. So having, I think that's what's most important is having those kinds of conversations as a community, right? Star said, why didn't you test the soil and have conversation about that, right? And these are hard things because we believe we know absolute truths. And so we're doing the same thing with people, right? Are these people safe here? Where do you want to live? What can we do to help you and support you?
Thank you. Liliana, checking in with you to see if there's another question here.
Yeah, I have a question for both of them from Mary Claire. At this time of regeneration at the Sekhmet Temple in the Nevada desert, we are very interested in designing permaculture gardens to ground the social and organizational gift economy principles. I love how you talked about shifting from scarcity thinking to creating abundance to address community needs. Can you please say more about how permaculture helps create the conditions for a shift from capitalism to reciprocal gifting?
I am the executive director of an organization called Common Vision, and another one of our sort of pandemic responses has been to start recovering food from a high-end organic online grocery store and taking that food and redistributing it at our school gardens to families and students, and also to that houseless community that I just talked about. In doing that, we're keeping that food waste out of the soil and out of our landfills, right? And because of the quality of food, and I'm talking organic chickens and sirloin steaks, even filet mignon, and any vegetable they have is all organic. We've been feeding that to our babies and to the folks who need food that is legitimately medicine and not just sustenance, right? So there was a time we went in and they had 6 cases of black pepper pate and milk rolls and little containers of microgreens. We took those 3 things to the encampment, and now people whose teeth are all messed up and they can't really chew meat can now have protein, right? And like mineral rich protein with these microgreens on bread that they can actually chew, right? And again, and in that mutual kind of way, we've learned not just to go in, get the food, and bring it to those poor people who live under the freeway, right? We've gotten some of those people under the freeway to go with us to do the work of getting this food and redistributing it and sharing it with their community. It's been a wonderful thing.
And that, I mean, Wanda talked about stacking functions earlier. It's one of our permaculture principles of getting more than one function, more than one use out of the same thing. And I think that stacks functions both in getting food to that community, but also in, you know, getting people in that community, giving them a job where they can be useful, they can make a contribution, they can earn some respect and some social power.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to recommend for the temple, this is a little off your question, but I think it's a really good resource. There's a wonderful series of videos by a guy named Neil Spackman. I'll put his name in the chat after I stop talking. But he has one that's called 10 Keys to Greening the Desert, about a project he did in Saudi Arabia in really intense desert conditions, where they worked with the local community and the local Bedouin tribes to create a food forest in this completely desert environment. And he's very, very good about understanding the ecology of the desert and of the food growing systems that they put together there. And I think that might be quite interesting.
Wonderful. I think that's a great tip. Thanks to both of you. I see Ursula Horn, Starhawk, was asking, what does TAPO mean? Can you just say that one more time?
TAPO, it's an acronym for thoughtful and protracted observation. So it's about actually stopping, looking, watching, listening. We say, like, we try to use thoughtful and protracted observation rather than thoughtless and high energy interventions, right?
It sounds a little better and actually
Right.
more welcoming for sure.
You know,
Thank
I
you.
mean, for example, if they'd used some Tapo on that garden by the freeway before they plowed it under, they might have stopped and observed and tested the soil. They might have discussed it with the community that's been doing the garden. They might have weighed the benefits of having the garden versus the potential dangers of any contamination. They might not have assumed that they knew more about that than the people who were doing the garden. Um, and I think that's really useful, again, not just in gardening, but in human systems too. If you go into a new community or trying to organize or build relationships, rather than jumping in and say, like, hey, you guys, I know all about what you need, right? Stop, look, listen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Liliana, do you have another question?
I have a question for Wanda. Wanda, tell us more about People's Grocery and how food can ignite social change.
Ooh-wee. It's funny to get a question about People's Grocery for People's Grocery is sort of one of the very first food and social justice organizations in our country, honestly. And I was its last executive director. And it was a very difficult experience. It was formed to grow food and do mobile deliveries and get food into the hood. But it also kind of, by the time I had inherited it, gone the way of many nonprofits where there really wasn't much resources left fiscally. There wasn't a lot of even human commitment left to it. And I have described my experience of leaving there as a real shattering. But I will say that after that experience is when I sort of limped over to the elementary school and started growing this garden in the same place that I'd been in terms of West Oakland. And I learned that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? We know this. I see another question in the chat too, though, that I would like to talk about in terms of slavery. There's a question about Black folks in particular, although I find it too in Latino communities where we can be resistant to wanting to even look dirty, right? Because we might appear to look like slaves, right? There's never been a teenage bunch of kids that I've dealt with that didn't go, I'm not trying to work in no fields and look like a slave. But I want to share a picture with you. I think I can do it. Is it still there? Hold on, excuse me 1 second. Why? Because this picture is worth it. Hold on. Here it is. Can you see this picture? You see these four ladies?
Yes.
That picture was taken in 1925 at an ex-slave convention. Who knew they had those? But all of these women in that picture are all over 100 years old.
Wow.
And Elizabeth Berkeley with the sort of shawl around her neck is actually 125 years old. And when I saw that picture, honestly, my first fully transparent reaction was, whoa, slavery, how bad was slavery if they're still 100 years old, standing that tall and strong? And when I allowed myself to consider that, I went, wait, they ate organic vegetables. They worked really hard with their physical bodies. They had community that was essential to their survival, and they had a spiritual connection with the land, right? And when my people were freed, we went running for the cities and away from that experience. But in doing that, left the power and the greatness in the ability to feed yourself and your family, right? And to trust in your community around you, and to know that the earth will sustain you. So one of the things I do is challenge my people and all people to go back to the land and the site of the trauma, right? And revisit that by working the land again, and reframe all of those experiences, honestly, for both the Black people and the white people, okay? And everybody else in between, so that we can move forward in that.
Thanks, Wanda.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a very deep question. I think that the reframing that Starhawk brought forward is so critical in the way that we need to transform in these very, very, very challenging times. Yes, absolutely. Starhawk, did you have anything that you wanted to comment there? As input?
I mean, I've run into that working with kids in the inner city. And I think what Wanda was saying is so true. It's really about giving them enough of an experience that they take ownership of the garden and don't just see it as, a chore. I also found that kids, almost no matter who they are, like when you're trying to get them to do work, I'm like, oh, slavery, slavery. And some of it you just kind of have to go, right, yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm the old lady. I'm not going to carry this bucket. You carry it, right?
Hear it.
Yeah.
And also it's an opportunity to talk about resilience, right?
Yeah.
Like there's shame in coming from, people that are slaves, but if we reframe that as being enslaved, and also talk about the resilience that is inherent in our bloodlines as a result of the experience, that becomes not just a point of pride, but confidence that we can do anything. Right.
But I think that's
Beautiful.
also why it's so important to have role models for kids that look like them, that come from the same community, because if I'm bringing something in, no matter how sensitive I am and how good it is, it's still something someone from outside is bringing in. If Wanda's bringing it in, it's just really coming from a different place.
Right. And honestly, not just for the kids, for all the people, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes what we don't talk about is, what impressions white people, for instance, may have of Black folks, and they don't even know that they have this limited view of what a farmer looks like, right? And the farmer looks like the Marlboro man and this kind of thing. I bring in my friend Otis, the compost king, and he's an ebony Black man that is, certainly well expressed and has a deep understanding of compost. And for both adults and for kids, it challenges and makes them aware of how they frame people, right? And to be encouraged to undo that work.
Thank you both for that. It's a very critical thing for people to actually feel a sense of ownership and to be able to transform their own relationship to the land. But Starhawk, you brought up one of the topics that is dear to my heart right now, which is about community elders. And you mentioned the fact that you said, I'm the old lady and I'm not going to carry that. So I wondered if you might talk about this idea of, what does it mean to be an elder right now in this type and this framework of community? Because, you've been involved in permaculture for a long time, and I know that you had your hands in the dirt and you were very strong, but you decided to, where are you now with that? in your years. So how did you gracefully or not so gracefully, recognize those different stages where as an activist, you were right up front. As a
Yeah.
permaculturist, you were right in the dirt. And then life has a cycle. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of internal transformation as you come to an elder, like also our plants? There's a
Yeah.
life cycle of our plants that we have to recognize.
Well, I'm still kind of right in there in the dirt quite a lot, but I don't bend down so easily. So I'm always looking for younger interns and people with better knees to help out. But I'm also telling myself a certain amount of carrying those heavy buckets is keeping my bones strong, right, in my elder years. Um, a certain amount of frontline activism, I think is good for the soul, but with between COVID and everything else, I haven't been sort of nose to nose with the riot police in the same way as I might have been once. But I had a wonderful experience in May of going to the Line 3 pipeline protests with a group called 1,000 Grandmothers for Future Generations. And it was a wonderful group, mostly based in the East Bay. Um, a lot of old Jewish women like myself, some Lakota elders, some other more diverse people. But I was like, this is the perfect action for me because we're renting a lodge. We're not camping out in the mud. I'm 70 now. I get to do the comfort action. And I always remember some old dear friends of mine, Moore and Louie, who were older than the rest of us when we were doing blockades and stuff, and would come to them and they would stay in the Holiday Inn. Yeah. I'm like, yes, you can make those accommodations and not have to feel guilty for doing that. I think it's also your role is a little bit different. We were there, actually, we weren't there at a time when the actions were heated up like they have been over the last week or so. So our role was more giving support and encouragement to the on the ground activists and helping them plan for how to welcome in larger numbers of people at the welcome camp. And we revitalized their garden. It was a wonderful permaculture moment, and just and it was as simple as saying, kind of like, you need some digging forks here. Right? You can't do this garden with the tools you have, and providing them. And I just got some wonderful pictures of all the produce they got from the garden. It's actually doing much better than my own garden is doing. So I think we have to think about that role shifting. And as you get older, maybe it's not so much the doing, but also the teaching and the passing on. But I also think it's good for us to do something and challenge ourselves, and not just assume that because we're at a certain age, we have to sort of sit back and give up.
So Starhawk, I know those old Jewish ladies, and they all came back raving about your leadership while you were there, knowing that I knew you. And I would just add, as I started a video series called Mama Wanda's Garden School, and it was intended for children, but it was really hard for me to allow myself to be called Mama Wanda. So I'm 61, and I'm working particularly this year on sort of intentionally and gracefully embracing this notion of being an elder. I do not experience myself in that way, in any way. And when the millennials come up and call me Mama Wanda and actually offer to get a plate of food for me, I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Right? But I'm also trying to accept what that means around respect and also use that position to teach, like you said, right? If you're going to elevate me to elder, I'm going to suck it down and try to give you something worthy, right, to go forward with on that. And if I means you can call me mama and you're 35, 40 years old, so be it.
Well, all I can say is I have to tell you, I was at a big festival one time in Portugal, and I've been asked to lead a ritual. I led a huge spiral dance, and all these, hundreds of people were doing this dance. We had this beautiful cone of power, and as it ended, this gorgeous young man, he was tall, he was black, he was, just beautiful, like
Right.
comes running up toward me with his arms open, flings his arms around me. I was like, yes. And he says, Grandma.
And it was a compliment.
So like, be glad it's Mama at this
Right.
point.
There you go. I'll remember that.
That's a great story. Jen, I noticed that you've unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to share on this topic of, as we're talking about elders?
Oh, not, no, I don't have any talk there. But not atmosphere, but I was just thinking about Afghanistan, and if you all would like to say something about that, about I look at, and there are these lands where nothing is growing, and permaculture would be great there. Just the relation people and all the tragedy that's happened because of our war there.
Yeah, I mean, the group, I have a friend named Sherry Moran who's been working with this group for, I think, 10 years now. They started talking about peace and nonviolence. They've done community organizing. They've done some great actions around human rights issues and stuff. And they took a permaculture course with a wonderful permaculture teacher from Australia named Rosemary Morrow, who has been working in places like refugee camps and stuff for many, many years. And they've been teaching and they've been organizing, community organizations and starting gardens and doing, similar work in their thing to what Wanda's been doing and what we've been doing. And now it's just devastating because their lives are threatened. Some of them have had to flee their area because they belong to an ethnic group called the Hazara, which is a tribe that the Taliban kind of targets. And, this one couple I know fled to Kabul and then had to finally were able to leave Kabul and get across the border just before everything shut down. There's another family, this beautiful young man who did an action some years ago. He had a bunch of Afghan men dressed up in burqas and kind of marched to the Human Rights Commission and then unveiled to draw attention to the situation of women there and to speak for women's rights. And now he's been getting death threats from the Taliban. He's on their list and we've been trying, they've been trying to get him out, and they were at the airport for 18 hours at that gate and finally had left and went home just because they were exhausted about an hour before those bombings happened. It's really difficult at this point even to know how many people are going to be able to get out, and then where they can go. We have people in Canada. We have an eco village who's willing to sponsor some people. We're making contacts with permaculture people all over the world and various people who are willing to take in refugees and sponsor them. But the problem is the government's getting them across the border, getting them visas, getting all the processing. And I mean, I'm not even going to go into the role of the US, because if I do, I'm just going to rant and rave and spit for, an hour about how we created this situation and then are completely abandoning people, you know, um, in the aftermath of it. Just even getting people who worked with our own military into the US has been a nightmare for people. And it's partly, I don't know what Biden and them were thinking about with this, but they did not do good planning for it. But it's also because Trump set up this whole situation with his peace agreement with the Taliban back when he was still president, that we were going to be out by May without any guarantees or any consideration. And then he and the Republicans, for 4 years they were in office, blocked getting visas for people who were like the translators for our own forces. I realize I am ranting. I could rant more, but at the moment what we're trying to stay focused on is I can't do much about getting people out of Kabul. I don't have the contacts. I have no idea how to do that. Other people are working on that. I said I will work on trying to raise some funds so that when it's possible, for example, in Canada, to sponsor a refugee, a sponsor needs to have a bank account with something like $20,000 in it for a year to show that you can provide material support. And not everyone who sponsors is going to be able to do that. So people are having to leave Afghanistan if they can get out with like nothing, no possessions, no money, leave everything behind. So they're going to need things like food and clothing and, stuff to set up a household and money to exist on for a while. Um, a lot of the people we're working with are permaculture teachers, they're organizers, they're educated people, they're people who will ultimately be able, I think, to create very productive lives. But this whole thing is hugely traumatic and nerve-wracking. So, yeah. And, they're not people who work directly to support the military or with the, they weren't translators or stuff. They were working in NGOs and working in the Afghan community. So even though they're just as much at risk as some of those people who did work with the military, there's no easy route to get them out through US visas.
You know, some of the kids at Hoover
Mhm,
came out of Yemen, right, and
mhm,
escaped Yemen. And, in public schools, you don't know a kid's particular background and story. You're just
mhm,
dealing with them in real time. And I would ask everybody to also just remember, particularly the children, but everybody, in the trauma that they've experienced that we can't imagine. There was a
mhm,
kid named Muhammad who, in frustration because the other kids were acting out in class, and I pointed it out, and he leaped up and he said, "Yeah, you all don't appreciate," he was a fifth grader, "you don't
mhm,
appreciate what you have. I was standing on a corner and I saw a building get bombed and 500 people died in front of me in that building," right? And he was a 10-year-old, right?
wow.
We had this kindergartner that he even into the spring, he was still crying every time they brought him home. I mean, to school. And everybody was really frustrated with him. And then one day his older sister revealed, "Yeah, I can't believe I'm living in an apartment over a store. I used to live in a mansion and I had a pool and I had security guards,
Mhm.
right? And here were these kids who were used to, at a Yemen level, real wealth and
Mhm.
privilege. And they find themselves in a West Oakland ghetto and don't even have the language to be able to explain what's going on for them, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's just, I hope that as the new folks come into our country and into our lives, that we stay cognizant of what their experience has been that we can't imagine, and be prepared to support the trauma and the behaviors and the healing that's necessary in that.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Starhawk and Wanda. We're sort of getting close to the top of the hour. So what I'd like to ask Starhawk is I have a few minutes, just a couple of minutes of just some, to close us out. And I wondered if you might end us with a prayer or
Mhm.
something that we could actually all end together with this holding this space for all of us and for Afghanistan. So let me just close this out and say thank you to both of you, Starhawk and Brenda Stewart, for being with us today, Liliana and Judith for providing the questions, and our tech support, Diane, of course, Genevieve always, and the International Feminists for the Gift Economy Network. I just want to alert you that we're going to be dark on September 11th, which is our next meeting time. Heidi Gutner Abendroth is celebrating, she's being celebrated for her 80th birthday in Berlin. Genevieve will be there.
Mhm.
So we won't see you again until September the 25th for our Salon 20th. We're going to be posting this video, the recording of our session, on the website maternalgifteconomymovement.org. If you want to be notified, there's a mailing list that you can sign up for. We welcome your questions and comments, and you can send them to us at maternalgifteconomy@gmail.com. So Starhawk, could you just please, as a community of women here together, what we can,
Mhm.
help us be grounded, reframing where we are so we can hold the space and help this transformation.
Well, let's just all take a breath and feel your feet on the ground. As you breathe in and out, imagine yourself like a tree with roots that go down into the earth. And maybe take a breath and release anything you want to let go of from those roots. And drop some of that good earth energy, that incredible gift that the earth gives to us every day of life, of nutrition, sustenance, of stability, drawing it up through those roots and up through all the layers of rock and waters and gravel and sand and topsoil, and up into your feet and legs, up into the base of your spine, your belly. Feel your spine unfurl like a beautiful tree. Imagine your arms and hands reaching up like branches and leaves to the sky, sweeping back down, touching the earth again. Feel that incredible energy from the sky, the gift of sunlight that just showers us with energy every day, the energy that's the driving force of all the life systems on the planet. Take a breath, draw some of that energy in, or maybe where you are, it's moonlight or starlight. Draw that in, down through the leaves and the branches, the top of your head, all the way down through your legs and feet into the earth. And maybe let's take a deep breath and imagine we could send some of that energy out. You can feel our links together like a web of connection and caring that stretches across the earth. And maybe we could cast that web over our friends in Afghanistan, over all those who are at risk right now, so that they know that there is a network of care and concern, that there are those who are praying for their protection and their well-being. And whatever goddesses, gods, spirits, energies, powers you might believe in or not, maybe we can just ask the universe just for a few miracles. To help that web create the protection and the opening of the ways that are necessary. And blessed be.
Blessed be. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and your time. We'll see you again in 4 weeks, September the 25th. Until then, enjoy the gifts and the bounty of the season. Be well, be safe. Most importantly, be kind to one another. Take good care, all. Bye for now.
Thank you.